Have you ever heard of a sitting president who the US actually put a multi-million-dollar bounty on to capture? Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is exactly that person. But here's the real question. Is this justice, or just politics? For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was known as Latin America's black jewel. Oil flowed endlessly from the ground, bringing in massive wealth. Caracas was once one of the richest capitals in the region. People's lives revolved around oil. The government ran on oil. And the economy, pretty much everything, hinged on a single resource: oil. For decades, the United States was Venezuela's biggest partner. Venezuelan oil shipped straight to refineries in Texas and Louisiana. US dollars flowed back to Caracas, fueling an entire political and social system. The relationship wasn't perfect, but it was steady, predictable. Then, things started to change in the late 1990s. In 1999, Hugo Chavez came to power with a message that was bold, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Oil belongs to the Venezuelan people, not foreign corporations or the American empire. Chavez nationalized the oil industry, expanded social programs, and openly challenged Washington. From that point on, Venezuela didn't just shift its economic policies, it repositioned itself on the global political map. The country became a symbol of Latin America's leftist wave and a hub of anti-US sentiment in the region. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Nicolás Maduro, a man with humble beginnings, a former bus driver and union leader, stepped into the country's highest office. But he didn't inherit a wealthy, thriving Venezuela. He inherited an economy almost entirely dependent on oil, a bloated state apparatus, and a deeply divided society. Then the oil prices crashed. Poor management and deep-rooted corruption took their toll. International sanctions started to squeeze. The result? An unprecedented economic crisis, hyperinflation, a collapsing currency, shortages of basic goods, and millions of Venezuelans forced to leave their homes in search of survival. In that context, Nicolás Maduro was re-elected president in 2018. But that election was immediately rejected by the US and many Western countries. Washington declared it didn't recognize Maduro's legitimacy and threw its support behind the opposition. Venezuela, once an oil-rich country, became a political battlefield, not a battlefield of bullets and tanks, but of sanctions, diplomatic statements, and international pressure. The confrontation reached its peak when the Trump administration took an unprecedented step. They filed criminal charges against Nicolás Maduro in the US, accusing him of terrorism and drug trafficking, and dangled a multi-million-dollar reward for any information leading to his capture. From that moment on, Maduro was no longer just a controversial president. He became the symbol of a much bigger question: when global power clashes, who gets to define what is justice, what is crime, and what counts as national sovereignty? So, Venezuela's story isn't just about one country. It's a warning about how resources, politics, and power can push an entire nation into the eye of history's storm. Then, in March 2020, the Trump administration stunned both diplomats and international law experts. The U.S. Department of Justice officially released an indictment targeting Nicolás Maduro, the sitting president of Venezuela, along with several high-ranking officials. In these documents, Maduro was no longer referred to as a head of state. Instead, he was described as the leader of a narco-state, at the top of a transnational cocaine trafficking network. The U.S. alleged that, for years, the Venezuelan government had colluded with armed groups and drug cartels in Colombia, turning Venezuelan territory into a transit hub for cocaine headed to the United States. And then came the symbolic punch. Washington offered tens of millions of dollars for any tip that could lead to Maduro's capture. Imagine that on the global stage. A sitting president, still in control of the army, the police, and the state apparatus, is being hunted by another country like an international crime boss. This isn't just a criminal case, it's a political message sent loud and clear. The US doesn't recognize Maduro as a legitimate president, and therefore doesn't recognize his head of state immunity. From Washington's perspective, the argument is internally consistent. The US claims that Venezuela's 2018 election was neither transparent, free, nor fair. So, in their logic, Maduro is merely an individual holding power unlawfully, not a legitimate representative of a nation. Once you accept that framing, prosecuting him becomes an act of law enforcement rather than political interference. But from Caracas' perspective, and that of many other countries, this sets a dangerously precedent. Venezuela reacted immediately and strongly. Maduro's government called the U.S. charges fabricated, part of a plot to overthrow a constitutional government. State media painted Donald Trump as someone who wanted to control the country's oil resources, willing to weaponize the law to achieve political goals. And it wasn't just Venezuela speaking out. Russia, China, Cuba, and several other nations warned that one country unilaterally prosecuting the leader of another could undermine the foundations of international law. Because if a superpower can decide who is a legitimate president and who is a criminal, the concept of national sovereignty becomes fragile, more fragile than ever. Meanwhile, Donald Trump didn't hide his political aims. He described Venezuela as a direct threat to U.S. security, not just because of drugs, but also because of the massive wave of migration from the country. Millions of Venezuelans left home, crossing into neighboring nations, and ultimately heading north. In speeches, Trump repeatedly tied the Venezuelan crisis to domestic issues in the U.S., from border security to crime. This is where domestic and foreign politics start to merge. Being tough on Venezuela helped Trump build an image of a strong leader, tough on drugs, immigration, and socialism, issues especially sensitive to American voters. In that narrative, Maduro was no longer just a foreign president, he became a symbol of everything Trump wanted to fight against. But the deeper you look, the more obvious it becomes that this prosecution can't be separated from the larger picture of global power. Venezuela is not a small, obscure country. It's resource-rich, strategically located in Latin America, and has close ties with the U.S.'s geopolitical rivals. When the U.S. calls Maduro a criminal, it's not just targeting a person, it's challenging a political model, an international alliance, and a long-standing distribution of power in the region. And at that moment, the biggest question starts to emerge: if this is truly about law and drugs, why Venezuela, and not some other country, becomes the target? Why is Washington willing to push tensions with Caracas to the absolute limit? The answer lies in what has shaped Venezuela's fate for over a century: oil. If you had to pick just one word to explain why Venezuela has always been at the center of the geopolitical storm, that word is oil. Oil isn't just a resource. Oil is power. And for Venezuela, oil has been both a gift and a curse. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. On paper, that number should guarantee prosperity for generations. But it's precisely the country's near-total dependence on oil that has made its economy dangerously fragile. When oil prices are high, everything seems manageable. The government has money to spend, to subsidize, to maintain political support. But when oil prices collapse, the entire structure crumbles like a building without a foundation. Under Hugo Chavez, and later Nicolás Maduro, oil wasn't just a source of revenue, it was a political tool. Venezuela used oil to build influence in Latin America, to supply cheap oil to allies, and most importantly, to reduce its dependence on the U.S. And that's exactly what worried Washington. For decades, the U.S. was used to oil in the Western Hemisphere following its orbit. When Venezuela started selling more oil to China, borrowing from Russia backed by oil, and partnering with Iran on energy, these weren't just business deals. It was a shift in power. And the U.S. responded with sanctions. Sanctions targeted Venezuela's oil industry, the heart of the economy. The state oil company, PDVSA, was cut off from the international financial system. Tankers were restricted from docking. Oil revenue, the lifeblood of the nation, was strangled little by little. The result? Venezuela's economy spiraled into collapse. Oil production plummeted. The currency lost value. Inflation went out of control. What remained was not a functioning market economy, but a prolonged humanitarian crisis. From the U.S. perspective, sanctions were described as a peaceful tool to pressure the Maduro government into change. But from Caracas' perspective, and that of many independent observers, oil sanctions were nothing less than a full-scale economic war. Here, a paradox emerges. The U.S. claims to want to protect the Venezuelan people, but its sanctions make daily life harsher. Fuel shortages lead to electricity shortages. Lack of foreign currency leads to shortages of medicine and food. Meanwhile, the ruling apparatus survives, adapts, and finds ways to endure. The question becomes: are the sanctions really about changing the regime? Or are they about reshaping control over this strategic oil resource? Because if you look deeper, Venezuela isn't just a domestic story. It's a key piece of the global energy puzzle. When oil supply is disrupted, prices fluctuate. When prices fluctuate, the whole world feels it. In that context, the US putting maximum pressure on Venezuela is also a message to other nations. Access to strategic resources is never just an economic matter. It is always tied to political power. And this is where oil becomes the bridge between economics and geopolitics. It explains why a country in South America can become a hotspot in the US's global strategy. It also explains why Washington is willing to go so far as to prosecute a sitting president, something that, under other circumstances, might have seemed unthinkable. But Venezuela doesn't exist in a vacuum. As the US ramps up pressure, other global powers step in. Russia, China, and Iran don't just see Venezuela as a political ally, they see it as a strategic partner in the broader competition with the US. And that's when the story starts to go beyond oil. If you look at Venezuela only as an economic crisis, you won't understand why tensions there are so prolonged and intense. But when you place Venezuela in the bigger picture of global geopolitics, it all starts to make sense. Venezuela isn't just a South American country. It's a strategic foothold, and in the world of great powers, footholds have value. For decades, the US has considered Latin America its backyard. From the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War, Washington has always sought to prevent strategic rivals from establishing a presence in the region. So when Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro started moving closer to Russia, China, and Iran, it wasn't simply a diplomatic choice, it was a direct challenge to the order the US was used to. Russia sees Venezuela through the eyes of a global power trying to expand influence. Moscow supplies weapons, military support, and invests in Venezuela's oil industry. In return, Russia gains an ally in the Western Hemisphere, a move that carries huge symbolic and strategic weight in its standoff with the US. China approaches Venezuela more quietly, but just as effectively. Beijing has loaned Caracas tens of billions of dollars, mostly backed by oil. For China, Venezuela is not just a source of energy, it's a link in a long-term strategy to diversify supply and expand global economic influence. Iran, meanwhile, sees in Venezuela a kindred spirit, a nation under US sanctions and isolation. The two countries cooperate on energy, refining technology, and shipping routes that bypass sanctions. This relationship is highly symbolic. Nations under US pressure turn to one another to survive. It's precisely the growing presence of these global rivals that has turned Venezuela into more than a regional problem in Washington's eyes. It's a hotspot in the global power struggle. As the US increases sanctions and political pressure, it's not just targeting Maduro, it's sending a message to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The message is clear. The US will not allow strategic rivals to strengthen their position right on the doorstep of its geopolitical backyard. But in this game, Venezuela gradually became more of a chessboard than a player. Every domestic decision in Caracas is scrutinized through the lens of global powers. Every move by Maduro carries implications that go far beyond the country's borders. And when great powers collide, the rules tend to become flexible. From a geopolitical perspective, the US prosecution of Maduro is not just a legal measure. It's a way for Washington to undermine the legitimacy of a government aligned with Russia, China, and Iran, while paving the way for a potential reshaping of the power order in Venezuela in the future. On the other side, Russia and China's continued support for Maduro isn't necessarily based on personal trust. It's strategic investment. Abandoning Venezuela now would be like conceding an important chess match to the US. What's striking is that throughout this entire geopolitical game, the Venezuelan people have almost no voice. They don't decide strategic alliances. They don't control the flow of oil. Yet they're the ones who bear the clearest consequences: prolonged economic decline, mass migration, and an uncertain future. Venezuela, then, becomes a vivid illustration of how small or medium-sized nations can be caught in the whirlpool of great power competition. When strategic location and resources become too important, national sovereignty is no longer absolute, it becomes a space for negotiation, bargaining, and challenge. And at this point, Venezuela's story goes beyond Latin America. It raises a fundamental question for the modern world order. in an international system where power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few nations. Can law and sovereignty really protect countries at the margins of the game? As the US pushed tensions with Venezuela to unprecedented levels, the world didn't stand silently by. International reactions quickly revealed deep divides in how countries perceive power, law, and sovereignty. Russia was one of the most vocal critics, calling US actions modern-day piracy, a statement that shows Moscow sees this not as law enforcement, but as the abuse of power by the strong against the weak. China also warned that unilateral prosecution and pressure on another nation's leader could create a dangerous precedent, where international law is replaced by the logic of power. For Beijing, if such a precedent is accepted, no country can be sure its sovereignty will be respected when a great power's interests are threatened. At the United Nations, these concerns became even clearer. While no country defended Nicolás Maduro personally, many member states opposed the unilateral prosecution of a head of state because it erodes the foundations of the post-World War II international system. If every superpower could decide who is a criminal and who is a legitimate leader, the rules-based order would become more fragile than ever. Yet amid all the legal debates, diplomatic statements, and back-and-forth condemnations, one reality is almost forgotten: the fate of the Venezuelan people. While global powers argue about right and wrong, millions of Venezuelans live without medicine, electricity, or the most basic necessities. Hospitals lack supplies, long blackouts paralyze daily life, food has become a luxury for many families, and the harshest truth is that they have almost no choice but to accept or leave their homeland. In this power game, Venezuelans are not decision makers, yet they're the first and hardest hit. When nations compete for influence, when laws are stretched to serve political interests, ordinary people, without voice or power, are always the first to lose. And that may be the coldest truth of all, but also the most thought-provoking lesson in the entire story of Venezuela.